Some MPs returned to the House of Commons this morning as the truckers' protest continues in downtown Ottawa for a fourth day. Meanwhile, the Ottawa Police Service is calling on residents to avoid the area for another day. This comes as many demonstrators say they will remain in front of Parliament Hill until their demands to end the COVID-19 vaccine restrictions and mandates are met. While the Prime Minister says the government is not intimidated, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe has said his government supports the protesters' bid to end the cross-border ban on unvaccinated truckers. Meanwhile, government officials and members of the public are condemning those involved in the trucker protest on Parliament Hill who've been shown jumping on the tomb of the unknown soldier. Chief of Defense Staff General Wayne Eyre said he was sickened to see protesters dance on the tomb and desecrate the memorial, adding they should hang their heads in shame. The Ottawa Police Service has said that national memorials were cleared and should be respected by all. Ontario and Quebec have eased some COVID-19 restrictions today. Both of those provinces will see a return to indoor dining, and fully vaccinated Ontario residents can now hit the gym or go see a movie for the first time in weeks. If all goes well, Quebec will further ease restrictions next Monday, while Ontario will wait until February 21st. In the Atlantic, students are heading back to schools in New Brunswick and PEI on Monday. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney says a truck convoy blockade of Highway 4 at the Coots border crossing into the U.S. must end immediately. He says the protest against vaccine mandates violates the province's Traffic Safety Act. The Mounties issued a statement last evening. It said they have been trying to reach a peaceful resolution and that some truck drivers tried to leave but couldn't because the highway is clogged with vehicles. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has tested positive for COVID-19. Mr. Trudeau has been self-isolating since late last week after one of his children tested positive. The Prime Minister says he is feeling fine and sent out a tweet this morning urging everyone to get vaccinated against COVID-19 and get a booster shot. A study of more than 1,200 patients hospitalized for COVID-19 in Toronto in 2020 has found that adult patients with disabilities had 36% longer hospital stays than those without disabilities. Researchers at the University of Toronto and Unity Health Toronto also discovered that patients with disabilities had a 77% increased risk of readmission within 30 days. Their study, published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, calls for greater accommodation for patients who need support in hospital and including disability-related figures in COVID-19 data collections. Teenage girls have one of the lowest suicide rates in Quebec, but are more likely to be hospitalized for suicidal behaviors. The province's Public Health Institute reports a 23% increase in the number of girls 15 to 19 who arrived at hospital emergency rooms after attempting to take their own lives. This was from 2020 to 2021. One researcher says that it's possible that teenage girls are more likely to be taken to hospital by family members for suicidal behaviors. Iqaluit officials continue to work on cleaning the city's water treatment plant. This comes after trace amounts of fuel were detected for the second time in a matter of months. Meanwhile, some residents are concerned that the contamination could happen again. Last year, about 8,000 people in the territory's capital city couldn't drink the tap water for 2 months. This was when a historic fuel tank leaked into the city's water system. University of Waterloo engineering professor James Craig says depending on how much fuel is in the ground from the original tank, the problem could persist for months. Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux is estimating a new 1% federal tax on vacant foreign-owned properties won't pad coffers by as much as the Liberals hope. The Finance Department has estimated the tax will bring in $200 million in the 2022 to 2023 fiscal year, and a total of $700 million over 5 years. Mr. Giroux's office projects the tax will bring in $130 million in its first year and $600 million over 5 years. Immigration Minister Sean Fraser says the addition of new staff will help the government cut a pandemic-related major backlog in the processing of immigration applications. He says the government should be back on track by the end of the year, and that it will also cut long wait times for people seeking study and work permits, permanent resident renewals, visitor visas, and proof of citizenship applications. Mr. Fraser says changes are also coming next month that will let permanent residents track their applications online. All right, stay tuned. We'll be right back with a look at anti-Semitism and the story of one Holocaust survivor. An interview with Miss Georgine Nash coming up next, so stay with us. Holocaust survivors recalled their agony on International Holocaust Remembrance Day last week. This to a world that they fear is in danger of forgetting one of the world's largest tragedies. At in-person and online events, both survivors and politicians warned about the resurgence of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. The United Nations chief also decried the resurgence of anti-Semitism. He said he was alarmed to learn recently that barely half of the adults worldwide have heard of the Holocaust, which saw the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others during the Second World War. Well, joining us now to share with us her personal experience during the Holocaust is Miss Georgine Nash, who was just 7 years old when the Holocaust hit her home country of Hungary. Miss Nash, welcome to Forum Daily.
Pardon?
And thank you so much for sharing your story with us, ma'am. Now, upon reading your story, we know one of your earliest memories is of your father being forced to work in a Jewish labor camp during the Holocaust. So let's start with that. Can you tell us about his experience through your eyes as a young girl?
Well, yes, my father had to go into these forced labor camps when I was 4 years old. So this was like a few years before I actually got involved. And so the way that worked was that he had to leave us, my mother and I was an only child, and be with this group of people for about 3 months at a time. And then he was able to come back for a few months, and then he had to go back again. So my memory is that I was always crying when he was leaving. And he was reassuring me that he will be back. You know, as a small child, I just remember that I was very distraught that he was going to be leaving us.
And we eventually found out that your father was disappeared. Can you tell us the story of what happened to your father eventually?
Well, that was a lot later than that. So you see, I lived in Budapest, and there the Jews were really not involved in the Holocaust, or not until 1944. That's when I was 7 years old. From the outlying countryside, people were deported already years before, but the Budapest Jews were still intact. But in March of 44, the Germans invaded Hungary. And at that time, very, very quickly, Adolf Hitler, who was sent by Adolf Eichmann, was in charge of getting rid of all the Jews of Budapest. So what we first had to do was that we had to move out of our apartment and move into a so-called Jewish or Yellow Star house. And these were houses all over the city, about 3,000 of them, where other people lived, not only Jews, but all the Jews had to move into one of these houses. So my mother had some friends, and they said that we could come in. They lived in one of these houses, and we can share their apartment. And there my memory was that we moved in and we took whatever furniture we were able to take with us. And it was extremely, extremely crowded, furniture up to the ceiling. And this was in June when we had to move. Before that, in April, we had to start wearing the Yellow Star. So that was the very first thing that happened to the Budapest Jews. And after that, we had to move into the Jewish house. So we were in this Jewish house, and my memory there is that the Allies were bombing constantly, and every time there was an air raid, the siren sounded, and we had to go down to the bomb shelter. And one of the times when this happened, after it was called off and we were able to go back to our place, a very excited child reported that there was an unexploded bomb in the top floor in one of the armchairs of one of the apartments. So we all had to go and check this out, which we didn't realize how dangerous that was. So we were in the Jewish house, and after a while, it seemed that it was like we didn't know what the next step would be. I don't think that my mother and I were aware of deportations. And my father, as I said, was with us and then not with us. But at one time, the governor of Hungary, Miklos Horthy, announced that we are now not going to continue in the war on the side of the Germans. This is not us, but the Hungarians. Mm-hmm. And so we are out of the war.
Welcome back to Forum Daily. I'm here with Miss Georgine Nash, a survivor of the 1944 Holocaust in Hungary. Now, Miss Nash, before the break, you were telling us about your father. He was forced to work in a Jewish labor camp ever since you were 4 years old. After the Nazi occupation in Hungary, you were forced inside a home for Jews. At that time, your father didn't go to his regular work shift at this labor camp. So tell us about the significance of him not making it to work on at that time.
Yeah, well, as I started saying, the governor announced that we're out of the war. And my father was home, just on a leave. And he said, well, if that's true, then I'm not going back to my unit. And so his commanding officer sent him a telegram urging him to come back to the unit. And my father was very adamant that no, we are finished with the war. He's not going back. And in this house, in this Jewish house, as I mentioned earlier, there were people living, not only Jews, other people as well who were not Jews. And one of them reported to the authorities that there is a person in this apartment who is actually should be in the army, but isn't, a deserter. And the Aerocross, who were the Hungarian Nazi Party, came by and picked him up and took him away. And we never, ever saw him again. And what I want to mention is that it was such an incredibly terrible, sad coincidence, because his particular group of labor campers all survived the war. That whole group were able to come back because many of them were killed during these labor camps. So that was the one thing that my father made a decision which turned out to be the worst decision of his life. So after this, my mother and I moved into a so-called protected house. And these were houses also, several of them, along the area of the Danube, where different countries were protecting Jews who move in there. We moved into a Swiss protected house. And there was Wallenberg, Swedish, protected houses. We were in a Swiss one. And in one room, it was one of these a large bachelor apartment. 40 of us were put in there. And we were sleeping on the floor, like very, very crowded. However, one day, an Aerocross guy came and ordered everybody to go down to the courtyard for roll call. And my mother had the presence of mind to say that, I'm so sorry, but my child is very sick. She has high fever. Would you mind counting us here so we wouldn't have to go down? And this was in November, a very miserable, cold November day. And the Aerocross guy said, well, all right. And the other 38 people never came back. They were marched over to the Danube the very same day, and they were shot into the river. You see, by this time, they wanted to get rid of all the Jews of Budapest. and it was too slow to send them to Auschwitz. So there were these groups of thugs who came around and took people, and they just shot them into the river. So that was an absolute miracle that we survived that particular time.
Definitely, ma'am. A really heartbreaking story there. I wish I could ask you more questions about your experience, but just about a minute left here, ma'am. Let's leave with a message for our viewers. So as world leaders and survivors are decrying the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the world, what would be your message for our viewers when it comes to remembering and learning from this horrible tragedy?
Well, unfortunately, it seems that we haven't learned enough. It's very, very important, I think, for us survivors to talk to people and tell them about our story. When I hear that there are people who still deny that this ever happened, I absolutely cannot believe it. And for people to understand that it's not only the persecution of Jews, but it's always a persecution of another group of people that people want to feel superior to. And as long as people feel that way, it's going to be very, very difficult to get rid of all that hate.
Ms. Georgine Nash, thank you so much for joining us today on Forum Daily and sharing your story with us. All right, stay with us. We'll be right back after the break with a look at top stories from around the world. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. The UN Security Council met today to discuss the standoff between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine. Russia's ambassador accused the West of whipping up tensions over Ukraine, but the U.S. ambassador accused Russia of the largest mobilization in Europe in decades. There are an estimated 100,000 Russian troops positioned near Ukraine's border. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has apologized in Parliament for a series of parties at his 10 Downing Street office and residence that violated his own government's COVID-19 lockdown orders. Mr. Johnson says he's going to make changes to the way the government is run and that he and his government can be trusted amid calls to resign. This was after the release of senior civil servant Sue Gray's report on 4 gatherings. Ms. Gray's report into another dozen parties has been withheld at the request of the police, who have launched a criminal investigation into the most serious alleged breaches of coronavirus rules. Police in Germany say 2 officers have been shot dead while on a routine patrol in the western part of the country. Police in Kaiserslautern said the shooting happened during a traffic check near Kuzel at about 4:20 a.m. on Monday. The officers were a 24-year-old woman and a 29-year-old man. The African Union has announced in a tweet that it has suspended Burkina Faso until constitutional order is restored in the West African country. The suspension of Burkina Faso comes a week after mutinous soldiers ousted democratically elected President Roch-Marc Christian Kaboré in a coup. They cited his inability to stem jihadi violence. The 15-nation West African group ECOWAS had already suspended Burkina Faso last week. This made it the 3rd nation in the regional bloc after Mali and Guinea to be punished for military takeovers in a year and a half. A U.S.-backed Kurdish-led force says that a prison overrun by the Islamic State group in northeastern Syria is now fully under its control. The group said Monday that it thwarted a dangerous plot by the extremists to launch further multiple attacks across the volatile region. The Syrian Democratic Forces said more than 120 of their fighters and prison workers died in the 10-day standoff at the Al-Sina prison. The SDF says that some 374 IS militants, including the initial attackers, were also killed. In the 3rd such attack in recent weeks, the United Arab Emirates forces have intercepted a ballistic missile fired by Yemen's Houthi rebels. Today's launch came as Israeli President Isaac Herzog visited the UAE, fueling tensions in the wider Persian Gulf region. Authorities say the remnants of the missile fell outside populated areas with no injuries or damage as a result. In its most significant weapon launch in years, North Korea says it has test-fired an intermediate-range ballistic missile capable of reaching the U.S. territory of Guam. The test of the Hwasong-12 missile could be a prelude to bigger provocations by North Korea, such as nuclear and long-range missile tests that pose a direct threat to the U.S. mainland. All 18 crew members have been rescued from a ship in the North Sea that was left drifting rudderless after a collision with another ship. The freighter Julietta D collided with another ship and is taking on water. The collision happened as Storm Malik hit parts of northern Europe over the weekend, killing at least 4 people, causing flooding, destroying houses, and leaving thousands of homes without electricity. Dolce & Gabbana is going to stop using animal fur in all its collections starting this year. The Milan fashion house says it will make the transition to eco-friendly faux fur. It is joining other luxury brands, including Armani, Gucci, Prada, and Moncler, in following guidelines set by the Fur-Free Alliance, a global network of animal rights groups. A pregnant New Zealand reporter has chosen Afghanistan as a temporary base for her uphill fight to return home because of her country's stringent COVID-19 entry rules. The 35-year-old Charlotte Bellis is expecting her first child with her partner, a freelance photographer and Belgium native who has lived in Afghanistan for 2 years. Ms. Bellis says she has sent dozens of documents to her government in her battle to return home, but so far to no avail. She told the Associated Press on Sunday that authorities in New Zealand are now offering to bring her back as a person in danger. The Canadian men's national soccer team is getting closer and closer to its first World Cup appearance since 1986. Canada is 4 points clear in the CONCACAF qualifying table. All right, that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. I'm Nima Rajan, and this was Forum Daily. We'll see you next time. Take care, Canada.